Hi, and welcome to this episode of Step Change Conversations. Today we are joined by Wiebe E, Bijker, who is Professor of Technology and Society at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Trondheim, and also a Professor at Maastricht University, but also plays a vital role within the Step Change project as a member of our advisory board. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Very happy to be here, Chris.
So for those who have not really much experience of the work you do, could you give a little bit of a detail of the background of your work you've done over the past few years within the fields of science and technology and the intersection of citizen science?
I'm originally trained as a physicist and an engineer, but then studied philosophy. And most of my work has been on the relationship between science, technology, and society. In the early days, that's more than 30 years ago, it was more at the micro level, understanding the shaping of technology by society. And later, that research agenda broadened to also investigating the impact that technology and science have on society. And the past, say, 15, 20 years, it was more focused on political questions of governance, democratization, and empirically a bit more focused on countries in the global south, in Africa and India. But I've been involved in various European projects that all from different perspectives dealt with that question, how to think about and how to improve the relationship between research and society.
And quite a lot of the research and the work you've done in the past has been about the socialization and democratization of science. Could you briefly go over what these terms mean in a modern sense, perhaps, in research?
When we say socialization of technology, socialization of science, that is basically it's a shortcut for talking about how science and technology are embedded in society, how they have a fit or less of a fit with the dominant values, the social structures, cultural contexts of that society. And so it's not only a descriptive term, there is also a normative element to it. There is a plea for more socialization of science and technology, because we've argued that with more socialization of science and technology, that science and technology will better function in those particular societies. Democratization is well, most people know what democratization is, but when I'm using those terms, it is important to distinguish two very different uses. One is democratization of society, and then asking the question how science and technology have an effect on those processes of democratization in society. And that can be detrimental or it can be positive. Detrimental in the sense that technologies may hamper privacy issues, and that may influence the trust people have in each other and in social institutions. Modern technologies of social media are a clear example of that it can enhance a kind of a hype that distorts the political agenda, but it also can help communication between politicians and the public. So I would argue that the role that technology plays, and with slight adaptations that would apply to science too, in our modern societies is enormous. But it can go both ways, positive or negative. So that is democratization of society, and then the role of science and technology. A very different kind of questions is related to the democratization of science or of technology. And people sometimes jumble these two terms up. When I talk about the democratization of science or the democratization of technology, it can mean things like involving more citizens, stakeholders in the process of science and technology. That would be one meaning. The third meaning of democratization then being more in terms of numbers, basically saying more people getting involved, either as students or in other ways of being involved in science and technology.
Quite recently, you've spoken quite a lot about how the societal contract between science and technology and society as a whole has changed. And obviously, that relationship has kind of seen some drastic shifts over the last decade or so, in part due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but due to a myriad of other kind of examples that has kind of shift the scales between societal trust and science, although science in general seems to be quite a trustworthy kind of profession, as kind of mentioned in quite a lot of like surveys of society's trust in these sort of things. I'm just wondering how these aspects of democratization and socialization of science has been impacted by these changes in the views of society, I suppose.
Yeah, you're right. That certainly is quite a lot changed in the past decade, but I think it's helpful to really take a broader historical perspective and think about, say, the last 5 decades, because I think that is where the real change has happened. And before, let's say before the 1970s, the general picture of science was that it provided facts in whatever mysterious way, and then that those facts would be picked up by society and would be applied either in technical innovations or in other ways of shaping society. But there was a very clear distinction between science and technology on one hand and society on the other. And science and technology developed almost autonomously, almost as a natural, as governed only by natural laws. Now that, and we often label that view of technology as technological determinism. Technology developing autonomously, but determining, having an effect on society. Now that changed rather drastically in the late 1970s, 1980s, when researchers showed that both science and technology are not at all so autonomously developing, and a much more constructivist view of science and technology developed. Showing how scientific facts, but also technical artifacts, actually are shaped by social interactions rather than, in a way, dictated by laws of nature and mechanics, etc. Which led to a realization that science and technology are value-laden because they are socially shaped, so they embed dominant values of that context in which they have been created, but also that it is possible to have interventions and to steer and to have a debate about what kind of science and technology you actually want. Because in the previous image, the image of the autonomous science and technology, there wouldn't be any point in having a discussion, a democratic discussion of what you want with science and technology, because it developed autonomously anyway. So only because of this new, more constructivist, social constructivist view of science and technology, it also became possible to have a discussion and to think about how to steer science and technology. Now, that led in the 2000s, so the first decade of the current millennium, to much more explicit thinking about policy making, steering science and technology to address large societal challenges, ranging from climate change to global peace and distribution of wealth, food security, etc., etc. So how to use science and technology to address those big challenges. And in the past decade, the last 10 years, 15 years, that more concretely was shaped in terms of approaches like RRI, Responsible Research and Innovation, or Open Science, or Citizen Science. But all those three labels, which I'm now using and which we probably will return to later, they basically are rooted in that 4 decades history of a changing both understanding of what the process of scientific research and technological innovation is, and the implications of that new understanding for the relationship between society and science and technology. As you mentioned, and it's important to remind people of that, there have been several surveys that show that the general public, that public generally still have quite a high trust in scientists and engineers, much higher than, for example, in journalists or policymakers. It doesn't mean that there can't be outcries of anger or mistrust. That always will happen, but generally these surveys show that that science and technology are still held in rather high esteem. Nevertheless, something happened in those previous 4 decades. The old image that science was something out there, which mysteriously produced facts and understanding and innovations, that has changed. And in that sense, that is even among the general public who doesn't read social constructivist articles in scientific journals, there is a growing awareness that science and technology are human work, that people actually do that, and that they make choices, and that would call for transparency, and that it makes sense to ask how they really do that and what choices they make. And does suggest that it is possible to get involved. So that has changed.
And as you mentioned before, with kind of the new evolution of how kind of science is kind of made more communal, I suppose. So bringing together within kind of the fields of RRI, citizen science, of course, open science, it's kind of opening the doors and kind of embracing other communities, such as, well, within the quadruple helix. So including those stakeholders, including those policymakers and the communities which science serve, I suppose. So they kind of embrace kind of a more open doors policy for research in the future, I suppose.
No, it's very clear that that policymakers in general, but also science policy and technology policymakers now recognize much more than, say, 30 years ago, how crucial science and technology are to address societal challenges, and this constructivist view of science now allows them to actually embrace that idea and think about how to steer science and technology. And that has resulted, and that's where the acronyms that you mentioned, RRI, citizen science, open science, etc., where those come from, that has resulted in policymakers quite explicitly building those styles of doing research into the funding and the steering of research. So the European Union built in the previous Horizon program, quite prominently built in RRI, Responsible Research and Innovation, and that has been that has been taken up by various national research councils. I know for sure about the Dutch and the Norwegian, but probably more in Europe, which quite explicitly asks researchers to think about involving stakeholders and or citizens, depending on their research questions. And it's not acceptable anymore to just window dress an answer to that question, but you have to, in order to I mean, in order to have a chance on receiving research funding, you really must come up as a researcher with a credible and a detailed plan how to involve citizens and stakeholders, and you're evaluated on that plan, and you may or may not get your research funding depending on how well you've done that. And similarly, it is requested that in an early stage you think about how your knowledge is going to be used. And just saying we'll publish it is not enough. You have to come up with a more detailed plan how to involve intended users of the knowledge that you're going to produce. And those are all elements that were completely non-existent and even inconceivable, say 40 years ago, but are now have now been integrated into much of the research funding, both of the European Union and of national research councils. And through that, RRI, open science, citizen science are now getting more and more built in and integrated in the research practice.
No, I think that's a really important point, just to reiterate, just sort of like, yeah, moving away from just including the buzzwords and the jargon within kind of project proposals, and actually going beyond lip service to implementing these changes at a fundamental level is just, yeah, very important, and kind of moves away from kind of this idea of siloing kind of information within certain research institutes or within certain journals, I suppose, and makes it more accessible to all. And is also quite important for applying this research and these innovations outside of kind of the academic bubble and make it more applicable for local and global contexts, I suppose.
I would like to make one sort of footnote. I mean, in the context of our conversation, we are talking about this in the context of step change, and that has this very explicit focus on citizen science. So I mean, I'm not at all unhappy with what I just said. But the footnote I want to make is that I do think that the research councils, and I'm not talking about the EU because of the different character of a Horizon program, but I'm talking about national research councils, that they should also reserve part of their research funding for non-directed, free, open research. So without requirements about which societal problem do you need to solve, and what kind of stakeholders will you involve. No, a much more open call for proposals, only as in the old days, let's call it like that, mostly steered by the internal development and agenda of scientific disciplines. So I do think that is still important. But we have been talking about that other half of research funding, which is geared towards addressing societal challenges, and then citizen science and RRI, etc., do have to play a very prominent role now.
Thank you very much. And last question, I suppose, it's sort of looking towards kind of the future of research and technology and innovation. I'm just wondering what challenges and opportunities you foresee in research, and if there's any recommendations that you would suggest for how citizen science can be used to promote kind of more inclusive research, I suppose.
Not we, but generally people should recognize that science and technology are crucial for shaping our current societies, and thus also for addressing whatever societal challenges there are. Now, having said that, then the question is how then to improve the way that science and technology help to address those challenges. And that is by including the elements that we have been discussing, citizen science, RRI, etc., basically by being more responsible. And I would like to quote another European project closely related that just finished, and where a manifesto for responsible biosciences makes a plea to develop a more extended concept of responsibility, and I quote, an extended concept of responsibility that beyond dealing with issues like research integrity, freedom of research, or transparency, the kind of individualistic ethical forms of responsibility, now could serve as a principle that reduces the negative impact of competition and equips science for better managing science-society relations. So extending the concept of responsibility from mostly an ethical, individual-oriented concept to something that is really addressing the relationship between science, technology, and society. And then we come back at where you started this conversation. We're referring to my plea for a new social contract between science and society. And then I do expect that working along these lines of RRI, open science, citizen science, that will enhance the trust in science and technology among the general public. It will also enhance questions about how exactly choices have been made. There will be, I would even say, hopefully, a wish to be more involved and to know more about what science and technology do. An important problem, and that would then be my final point about responding to your question, what would this mean for citizen science? I think an important point that also the Step Change project will help us to think about is, what does that mean to involve citizens and stakeholders in science? We don't mean that from now on we want to take a vote whether 2 + 2 is 4, and that we are prepared that if a majority votes for 5, then from hence on it's 2 + 2 is 5. No, it's not like that. So involvement of citizens and stakeholders is something else than themselves changing the content of scientific findings, although they may have a bearing on it. So we need to think more carefully about that. And I think what I would like to add 2 remarks. One is that it is important to make a difference between citizens and stakeholders. Stakeholders hold a particular stake. So patients have a stake in better knowledge about their particular disease. So they're stakeholders in a debate about, well, funding particular types of medical research, applying certain forms of medical technology. I want to talk about citizens when actually there is not a very specific stake being debated, but it's more about the setup of society at large. What kind of society do we want? Where anyone may have various sorts of stakes. Then we are approached, we play a role as citizens rather than as specific stakeholders. Just one example, about 10 years ago, I coordinated a big societal dialogue in the Netherlands on nanoscience. And that was quite explicitly geared towards the citizens, because we wanted the Dutch population to think about the kind of society that they wanted in the future and what role nanoscience and nanotechnology could play with that. And of course, there were various stakeholders and stakeholder groups involved in the dialogue too, but it was shaped as a discussion with citizens, and it was asking input from citizens about the kind of society that they want. So that's one distinction I want to make. The second distinction, which is more directly relevant for the problem that I just sketched, that we don't want to vote for 2 + 2 is 5 or 4, is that it is helpful to make a distinction between what Harry Collins and Robert Evans have called contributory expertise and interactional expertise. Contributory expertise is expertise where you can actually contribute to the core process of science. And you would typically only acquire contributory expertise by training, by a long-term socialization into a particular scientific community. Interactional expertise is something else. It is the expertise to be able to talk to scientists and engineers, to understand the choices they make, to understand the agenda that they are following, to also have a say about what you think is important in terms of an agenda and in terms of risks and benefits that they should keep, should think about. So that is expertise. It does require you to at least develop some understanding of the language that these scientists and engineers talk in, but not as much as contributory expertise. Now, my claim is that interactional expertise is something that actually is quite feasible to be acquired by most citizens and stakeholders. I mean, they must do a little bit of effort. You have to work for it, but then you can have the interactional expertise to actually, well, talk to scientists, be involved in the process, the upstream process before the research starts, of making choices in the agenda, setting priorities, having a say in what needs to be funded or what not. You definitely have a role in the downstream phases of research, where the application of insights, the use of knowledge plays a role. But for that, the core of the research activities, well, then some, say, stakeholders like patients may actually have contributory expertise, because they can contribute their patient's knowledge of their particular illness to the scientific process. But most people would not have contributory expertise and would not have a clear role in that core part of doing science. So that distinction between contributory and interactional is important, and also to think about upstream core of research and downstream phases of research is also helpful. Now, having said that, I think that, well, we're still in the middle of the step change project, but I would hope that in the various case studies, the various sub-projects of step change, we will be able to see different forms of what I've just described as upstream, core, or downstream forms of citizen science, using either and mostly probably interactional expertise, but maybe even in some cases contributory expertise. But we'll see. I mean, that's still all in the making, and I'm very keen to follow that whole process.
Yes, and we've just passed our kind of midway point of the project, and it's going to be very exciting to see what the CSIs come up with the remainder of their time. I do have one final question. It's a bit more of a personal one, just to you. Over the last few years / decades, we've seen a very big increase in sort of the capabilities of technology with AI, quite a lot coming up quite recently about ChatGPT. I was just wondering what area of technology that you're most excited about and think might be the most impactful in the next 5 or 10 years, do you think?
I find that extremely difficult to answer. I mean, I do see that the example that you give, a reference to AI, which could both be a reference to machine learning and a reference to big data, that is already having a huge impact on research. I mean, I've chaired the National Research Agenda Selection Committee in the Netherlands for the past 4 years, and even in those 4 years, there was a clear increase in the use of both machine learning and big data in a huge variety of research projects. So that's clearly happening. I don't predict that is having more of an impact than some of the other trends. I mean, another trend, a very different trend, is an increased involvement of intended knowledge users, citizen stakeholders in research, about everything that we've been talking about in this conversation. And it is just conceivable that if we would look back at this period from, say, 20 years in the future, that we would say that the impact on research from the involvement of non-scientists has been bigger and more profound than the use of machine learning. I have no clue of knowing that, but I think that both vastly different trends, use of AI, and on the other hand, opening the doors of say the laboratory, and involving citizens stakeholders, they both are very exciting, and they both will have a profound effect. But don't ask me which will be more profound. Though I was trained as an engineer and a physicist, I'm not typically getting sort of being aroused by gadgets.
Sure.
No, maybe more by those social technologies and new forms of human development rather than technical development.
Sure. No, thank you very much. And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation.
It was a pleasure.